The smell of burning sage and pine was the first warning, a scent that clung to the dry air long before the pillar of black smoke became visible against the vast, unforgiving blue of the Montana sky. Mai stood on the porch of the small cabin her husband, Jen, had built with his own hands, the worn with a familiar comfort beneath her bare feet. She was 27, a widow in a land that did not want her, a ghost in a light pink prairie dress that seemed too delicate for the grit and dust of the West. Her gaze, however, was anything but delicate. It was the hard, steady gaze of a hawk, scanning the horizon where the smoke churned, a dark wound in the otherwise perfect day. Her hands, usually busy with mending fences or tending to the small herd of cattle that was her legacy, were still. She did not need to see the riders to know who they were. Silas and his men. They had been circling for weeks, their presence a constant, low-grade threat, like the distant rumble of a storm that refused to break. Now, the storm was here. Her allies, the old ranch hands Jeb and Maria, came running from the barn, their faces etched with the fear that Mai refused to show. "Mai, they fired the north pasture!" Jeb yelled, his voice thin and reedy against the vastness of the landscape. Maria, her face a mask of worry, wrung her hands. "We have to leave, Mai." There are too many of them, but Mai's eyes were fixed on the smoke, her expression unreadable. She had lost too much in this place to run. Jen was buried on the hill overlooking the valley, his spirit woven into the fabric of the land she now called home. To leave would be to lose him all over again. The heat from the approaching fire was a physical presence now, a wave of shimmering air that distorted the familiar lines of the mountains. Silas wanted her land, the water rights that came with it. He saw a vulnerable Chinese widow, an easy target in a world that favored men like him. He did not see the woman who had learned to read the land as if it were a book, who knew the secrets of every rock and ravine. He did not see the survivor. Mai turned to Jeb, her voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the rising panic in his eyes. "Get the cattle into the lower canyon. There's a fire break there." "Maria, fetch the rifle from the cabin." And the knife. The last two words hung in the air, a quiet promise of the violence to come. Maria's eyes widened, but she nodded, her fear momentarily eclipsed by the quiet authority in Mai's voice. Mai herself did not move. She watched the smoke, a predator watching its prey, her mind a cold, clear space where fear had no room to grow. She was a part of this land, as much as the sage and the pine and the wolves that roamed the high country. And she would defend it, or die on it. The fire was coming, but so was she. The memory rose unbidden, a ghost from a winter so cold it felt as if the world itself had frozen solid. Jen was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a phantom, leaving a trail of fresh graves in its wake. Mai was alone, the silence of the cabin a crushing weight. The grief was a physical thing, a hollow ache in her chest that never seemed to fade. But there was no time for grief. There was only the endless cycle of survival. The wolves came in the dead of night, their howls a mournful chorus that echoed off the snow-covered peaks. They were gaunt and desperate, driven down from the high country by hunger. They had already taken 2 of her cattle, their carcasses a grim tableau in the frozen pasture. She had the rifle, but ammunition was scarce, each bullet a precious commodity she could not afford to waste. So she had waited, her patience a weapon in itself. She had tracked them for 2 days, her small frame wrapped in layers of wool and fur, her face numb with cold. She moved like a shadow across the snow, her steps light and sure, a hunter in her own right. She found them in a small clearing, their eyes glowing like embers in the twilight. There were 3 of them, their lean bodies coiled with a desperate energy. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. She had only the knife Jen had given her, its blade honed to a razor's edge. He had taught her how to use it, not for fighting, but for skinning game, for carving wood, for the practical necessities of life on the frontier. But in that moment, it was the only thing that stood between her and a violent death. The alpha male lunged first, a blur of grey fur and bared teeth. Mai did not hesitate. She dropped to one knee, the knife held low, and drove it upward as the wolf's momentum carried it over her. The blade found its mark, a clean, deep cut that severed sinew and artery. The wolf fell, its lifeblood staining the snow a vibrant crimson. The other 2 paused, their predatory instincts warring with a sudden, primal fear. They had never encountered prey that fought back with such cold, calculated fury. Mai rose to her feet, the knife slick with blood, her eyes meeting theirs across the frozen clearing. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a grim, unyielding resolve. She was a widow, a solitary figure in a vast, indifferent landscape. But she was not weak. She was a survivor, forged in the crucible of loss and hardship. The remaining wolves, their courage broken, turned and fled, their howls now a sound of retreat rather than aggression. Mai had stood alone in the deepening twilight, the dead wolf at her feet, the cold seeping into her bones. She had learned a valuable lesson that day. The world was full of predators, but she was one of them. Back in the suffocating heat of the present, the memory of the cold winter served as a stark reminder of her own resilience. The fire raged, a wall of orange and black that devoured everything in its path. Silas and his men were closer now, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the flickering light. They rode with an easy arrogance, confident in their numbers and their power. They saw the flames as their ally, a tool of intimidation to drive the lone woman from her home. They did not understand that Mai had a deeper, more intimate relationship with the forces of nature. She had seen fire clear the land, making way for new growth. She had seen the way the earth healed itself, the way life always found a way to endure. The fire was a threat, but it was also a part of the cycle, a force to be respected, not feared. Jeb and Maria had done as she asked, their loyalty a small beacon of light in the growing darkness. The cattle were safe, for now. The rifle was in her hands, its weight a familiar comfort. But it was the knife, tucked into the leather sheath on her belt, that felt like an extension of her own will. It was the tool of a survivor, a symbol of her refusal to be broken. She moved with a fluid grace, her pink dress a strange, almost ethereal sight against the backdrop of smoke and flame. She did not seek cover in the cabin, a wooden box that would quickly become a trap. Instead, she moved towards the rocky outcropping that overlooked the main trail to her property, a natural choke point that would force Silas and his men to approach her one by one. She was not a soldier, but she understood the principles of strategy. The land was her ally, its contours and features as familiar to her as the lines on her own hands. She found her position, a small crevice in the rocks that offered both cover and a clear line of sight. From here, she could see them coming, their faces illuminated by the inferno they had unleashed. Silas was in the lead, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He thought he had already won. He saw a frightened woman, a piece of property to be claimed. He did not see the predator waiting in the shadows, her senses honed, her resolve absolute. The air was thick with the smell of ash and ozone, the roar of the fire a deafening symphony of destruction. But in Mai's mind, there was only a profound and chilling silence. She was in her element, a creature of the wild, ready to defend her territory against all who would dare to take it from her. The first rider came into view, his face a canvas of cruel amusement. He was a big man, his shoulders straining the seams of his dusty shirt, a repeater held loosely in his hands. He was a dog let off the leash, eager for the violence his master had promised. Mai raised the rifle, the stock cool and smooth against her cheek. She did not aim for the man. Not yet. She aimed for the ground in front of his horse, a puff of dust and rock erupting a few feet from its hooves. The horse shied, whinnying in terror, its eyes wide with panic. The rider cursed, fighting to control the spooked animal. It was a warning shot, a clear and unambiguous statement. But Silas and his men were not the kind to heed warnings. They saw it as a sign of weakness, the desperate act of a cornered animal. Laughter, harsh and mocking, echoed through the canyon. "She's rattled, boys," Silas called out, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Let go smoke the little rabbit out of her hole." He spurred his horse forward, his men fanning out behind him, their confidence unshaken. They were a pack, their strength in numbers, their cruelty a shared bond. But Mai was not a rabbit. She was a wolf, and they had just stepped into her den. The second rider came, more cautious this time, his eyes scanning the rocks. Mai fired again, her movements economical and precise. This time, the bullet found its mark, not in flesh, but but in the leather of the man's bag, a clean shot that sent a canteen spinning through the air. The man yelped, a sound of surprise rather than pain, but the message was clear. She was not rattled. She was in control. And she was a better shot than they had anticipated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Silas's face, a momentary crack in his arrogant facade. He had expected tears, pleas, a quick and easy victory. He had not expected this cold, calculated resistance. Spread out, he commanded, his voice now laced with a new urgency. Find her. I want her alive. The men dismounted, their boots crunching on the rocky ground, their rifles now held at the ready. They moved with a clumsy, oafish purpose, their city-bred skills no match for the terrain. Mai, in contrast, was a part of the landscape. She moved from one position to another, a phantom in the smoke-filled twilight. She was a whisper of movement, a fleeting shadow, always one step ahead of them. She did not waste her shots. Each bullet was a carefully chosen word in a deadly conversation. One man's hat was sent flying from his head. Another's rifle was splintered in his hands. She was not trying to kill them. Not yet. She was disarming them, dismantling their confidence, turning their arrogance into a weapon against them. The fire raged on, a third combatant in this deadly dance, its heat and smoke adding to the chaos. But for Mai, it was a familiar partner. She knew its rhythms, its patterns, its insatiable hunger. And she would use it, just as she used every other element of her world, to ensure her own survival. The game of cat and mouse could not last forever. The fire was closing in, its relentless advance shrinking the battlefield, forcing a confrontation. Silas, his face now a mask of frustrated rage, finally located her. She was crouched behind a granite boulder, the rifle empty, her expression a calm and unnerving counterpoint to the chaos around her. He approached slowly, his pistol drawn, a triumphant sneer twisting his lips. "Nowhere left to run, little lady," he said, his voice a low growl. Your little tricks are over. His men, their bravado shattered, hung back, their fear of the woman in the pink dress now greater than their fear of their employer. They had seen what she could do with a rifle. They did not want to find out what she could do up close. Mai rose to her feet, her movements unhurried, her gaze never leaving his. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. Words were his weapon, a tool of manipulation and deceit. Her weapons were silence, resolve, and the knife that was now in her hand. The firelight glinted off the polished steel, the blade a sliver of deadly beauty. Silas faltered, his step momentarily checked by the sight of the knife and the utter lack of fear in her eyes. He had seen fear in the eyes of hardened men, in the eyes of animals trapped and cornered. But in Mai's eyes, he saw only a reflection of his own mortality. He saw a woman who had already faced death and had not blinked. "You think that little pig sticker is going to save you?" he scoffed, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. "I'm going to enjoy breaking you." He lunged, a clumsy, brutish movement born of anger and a desperate need to reassert his dominance. Mai did not retreat. She moved to meet him, her body a blur of motion, the knife held in a reverse grip, its point aimed not at his chest, but at the tendons and muscles of his arm. She was not trying to kill him. She was trying to disarm him, to take away his power, to leave him as helpless as he had tried to make her. The blade sliced through fabric and flesh, a clean, deep cut that sent a jolt of searing pain up Silas's arm. He cried out, a sound of shock and agony, his pistol clattering to the ground. He stared at his arm, at the blood that was now soaking his sleeve, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The Chinese widow, the easy target, the frightened rabbit, had just crippled him with the skill and precision of a master surgeon. She stood before him, the bloody knife now held at her side, her pink dress stained with his blood. The fire raged around them, a fitting backdrop for this primal struggle for survival. Silas looked from his bleeding arm to her face, and for the first time, he understood. He was not the predator here. He was the prey. And the hunt was far from over. From the smoke, a new sound emerged, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, a sound that did not belong to the scattered horses of his men. Mai's expression did not change, but a new light entered her eyes. The allies she had been waiting for, the ones who understood the true law of this land, were finally arriving. But so were the flames, threatening to engulf them all. The riders emerged from the swirling smoke-like apparitions, two figures on powerful horses that seemed undaunted by the flames. They were the Connelly brothers, Amon and Finn, ranchers from the neighboring valley whose land bordered Mize to the west. They were good men, their faces chiseled by the same sun and wind that had shaped Mize, but they moved with the caution of those who knew that trouble in this land often spread like the fire itself. Amon, the elder, held a shotgun across his lap, his eyes sweeping the scene with a grim appraisal. Finn, younger and quicker to anger, had his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. They saw Silas, clutching his bleeding arm, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. They saw his men, scattered and unnerved, their pack mentality broken. And they saw Mize, standing calm and resolute amidst the chaos, the bloody knife in her hand a stark testament to the fight she had just won. There was a long, tense moment where the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of Silas. The Connelly brothers did not speak, their presence a question in itself. They had come because they had seen the smoke, a signal of distress in the unwritten code of the frontier. But they had arrived to find not a victim in need of rescue, but a warrior in control of the battlefield. Silas, seeing potential saviors, found his voice. "She's a crazy woman," he spat, cradling his arm. "She attacked me. Tried to kill me." Amon's gaze shifted from Silas to Mize, his expression unreadable. He had known Jien, had respected him. He had watched from a distance as Mize held the ranch together after his death, a quiet testament to her strength. He had heard the rumors of Silas's ambition, his methods of persuasion. He looked at the fire, a deliberate act of destruction, and then at the clean, precise wound on Silas's arm, an act of defense. The pieces did not fit Silas's story. Mize remained silent, letting the scene speak for her. She knew the Connellys were not here to fight her battles, but to protect the peace of the valley. A range war was bad for everyone. Her actions had to be seen not as aggression, but as a necessary response to a direct threat. The fire was her witness, its destructive path a clear indictment of who had started the violence. Finn, ever the more direct of the two, finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Looks to me like you brought a fire to a knife fight, Silas." And lost the words, simple and direct, hung in the smoky air, a verdict delivered. Silas's remaining men shifted nervously, their loyalty to a wounded and humiliated leader evaporating in the intense heat. They were hired guns, not zealots, and the odds had just shifted dramatically against them. The immediate standoff was broken by a sudden shift in the wind. A gust of hot air fanned the flames, sending a shower of embers cascading toward the dry timber of the barn. The human conflict was instantly dwarfed by the more pressing, indiscriminate threat of the fire. Mize was the first to move. The confrontation with Silas was over for now, the land itself was crying out. "Jeb!" "The well pump," she commanded, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "Maria, get the blankets from the house. Soak them." Her authority was absolute, born not of wealth or title, but of pure competence. The Connelly brothers, men who commanded their own ranches, did not hesitate to follow her lead. Amon dismounted, his shotgun now forgotten. "Finn, get the horses clear. I'll help with the pump." The scene transformed from a tense standoff into a desperate, chaotic struggle against nature. Jeb, his fear replaced by adrenaline, worked the iron pump handle with a frantic energy, the rhythmic squeak and groan a desperate heartbeat against the fire's roar. Maria emerged from the cabin, her arms laden with heavy wool blankets, her face grim with determination. Mize, moving with an economy of motion that bespoke a deep understanding of the work, organized the small force. They formed a bucket brigade, a thin line of defense against the inferno. The smoke was a choking blanket, stinging their eyes and searing their lungs. The heat was a physical blow, blistering their skin. Trees exploded in the distance, their sap boiling in the intense heat, the sound like cannon fire. Silas and his one remaining man stood uselessly aside, forgotten antagonists in a much larger drama. Silas, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, watched with a venomous hatred. He had meant to break her, to see her spirit crumble into ash like her pastures. Instead, he was watching her lead, watching men far stronger than him follow her commands without question. He was watching her save the very thing he had tried to destroy, her resilience, a personal and profound insult to his power. Mai worked tirelessly, her light pink dress now stained with soot and sweat, a flag of defiance in a world of black and orange. She was a force of nature in her own right, her will as unyielding as the fire she fought. Every bucket of water thrown against the flames felt like a small victory, a reclamation of her home, a testament to her refusal to be erased. The fight lasted through the night. It was a grueling, primal battle of human will against elemental fury. By the time the first pale light of dawn broke over the scorched mountains, the fire had been beaten back. It had not been extinguished, but it had been contained, a perimeter of wet earth and soaked blankets holding it at bay, saving the cabin and the barn. The north pasture was a blackened wasteland, the air thick with the smell of wet ash and burnt pine, but the heart of the ranch, the home that Jen had built, was safe. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on them all. Jeb and Maria had collapsed near the well, their faces smudged with soot, their bodies trembling with fatigue. The Connelly brothers leaned against a fence post, their usual stoicism replaced by a weary respect. They looked at the devastation, then at Mai, who stood watching the rising sun paint the smoke-filled sky in shades of grey and bruised purple. She alone seemed untouched by the fatigue, her posture straight, her gaze clear. It was as if the struggle had fueled her rather than drained her, refining her spirit to a harder, purer state. Now, in the quiet aftermath, the human problem remained. Silas and his last man were huddled near the trail, guarded by a now-rested Finn. The question of justice hung in the air, as thick and acrid as the smoke. "What do you want to do with them, Mai?" Amon asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We could take them to the sheriff in Miles City, but that's a 2-day ride, and his brand of justice is unreliable." The subtext was clear. The official law was far away and often favored men with money and influence like Silas. Or, Finn added, his hand drifting back to his Colt, "we could handle this ourselves. Save the county the expense of a trial." It was the way of the West, a harsh and often brutal code that had little room for nuance. A man who burns another's land and threatens a woman has forfeited his right to a civilized trial. They were offering her vengeance, a swift and permanent solution to the problem of Silas. All she had to do was nod. All she had to do was give the word, and Silas's life would end here, in the ashes of his own failed conquest. They looked to her for the decision, this small, quiet woman who had demonstrated a capacity for both precise violence and unwavering endurance. Her ranch, her fight, her justice. Mai walked over to where Silas was being held. He looked up at her, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and undiluted hatred. The pain from his arm was a constant, throbbing reminder of his humiliation. He expected a verdict of death. He braced himself for it, trying to muster a final shred of defiance. But Mai's gaze was not one of a vengeful executioner. It was cold, analytical, like a rancher assessing damaged livestock. She looked at him not as a monster to be slain, but as a problem to be solved, an equation to be balanced. Killing him would be easy. It would be satisfying on a primal level. But it would also be messy. It would create martyrs and blood feuds. It would invite questions from the distant, meddling law that Amon had mentioned. Death was an ending, but Mai was thinking about the future. She was thinking about long-term survival, not short-term satisfaction. She turned to Finn. "Take his gun. And his horse. And his boots." The command was so unexpected that it took everyone a moment to process it. Finn blinked, confused. "His boots?" Mai nodded, her eyes still locked on Silas. "A man like this, his pride is everything. It's the only real currency he has. You kill him, and he becomes a story, a legend in some saloon. You strip him of his pride, you make him walk home in his socks, he becomes a joke. No one will follow a joke." The logic was chilling in its simplicity and profound in its cruelty. She was not just defeating him, she was erasing him. She was dismantling the very foundation of his identity as a powerful, feared man. Amon slowly began to smile, a deep and genuine expression of admiration. He understood. This was a far more devastating punishment than a quick bullet. It was a sentence of social death, a public castration of Silas's authority. Silas stared at her, his face draining of all color as the reality of her judgment settled upon him. He would have preferred to be shot. He would have begged for it. To be forced to walk back to town, broken, disarmed, and barefoot, was a humiliation from which he would never recover. His name would become a punchline, a cautionary tale for arrogant fools. His power, built on a carefully crafted image of ruthless strength, would evaporate before he even reached the first saloon. He had tried to burn her world to the ground, and in return, she had handed him a fate worse than death. Finn did as he was told, pulling the worn leather boots from Silas's feet with a grim satisfaction. The other man, seeing the tide had turned so completely, offered no resistance, eagerly surrendering his own weapons and horse in exchange for his life. Silas was left standing in his socks on the hard, rocky ground, his face a grotesque mask of fury and shame. Mai gave him a final, dismissive look. "Start walking," she said, her voice flat and devoid of any emotion. The two men, one bleeding and the other terrified, began the long, ignominious trek back towards civilization. The Connelly brothers watched them go, shaking their heads in a kind of weary awe. They had seen many forms of frontier justice, but none so cold, so precise, so utterly complete. They tipped their hats to Mai, a gesture of profound respect. "If you need anything, Mai," Amon said, his voice sincere, "you know where we are." They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Mai alone in the quiet devastation of her ranch. She stood for a long time, watching the smoke from the still smoldering fires rise into the morning sky. There was no sense of triumph, only the hollow ache of survival, the knowledge that this victory was just a temporary reprieve. She turned her attention to the practicalities of the damage, her mind already calculating the cost of lost grazing land, the time it would take to mend the fences. As she was kicking through the debris near where Silas had fallen, her foot struck something hard. It was a leather satchel, dropped in the struggle. Inside, amongst a few papers, was a map of her valley. It was professionally drawn, far more detailed than anything a local rancher would possess. Marked on it were not just her property lines, but geological survey notations, markings that indicated mineral deposits. And tucked within the map was a letter, bearing the letterhead of a prominent East Coast Railroad company. The letter spoke of acquiring the valley's water rights by any means necessary to support a new railway extension, and it was addressed not to Silas, but to a regional director of acquisitions. Silas had not been the wolf. He had been the dog on the leash, sent to chase the sheep from the pasture. The real predator was a faceless corporation hundreds of miles away, an entity with endless money and power, an opponent who could not be disarmed with a knife or shamed into retreat. Mai looked up from the letter, her gaze lifting from the blackened earth of her home to the distant eastern horizon. The fire was out, but a new, far more dangerous storm was gathering. And she was standing directly in its path.